One day, my husband Charles shocked me by revealing that he knew about the $6 million inheritance I had received after my father passed away. I had kept it a secret, unsure about our future due to his controlling nature and my growing concerns about his greed. His knowledge left me stunned, and before I could even respond, he grinned and suggested using the money to remodel our family home. When I confronted him, it became clear he had manipulated my mother into revealing the secret. His boldness infuriated me, but when I protested, he dismissed my concerns with a wave, saying my objections didn't matter because the decision was already made. I'm Patricia, a 31-year-old working at a prestigious bank. My demanding job left little room for a personal life, which led me to join a matchmaking agency. That's where I met Charles, a cheerful livery driver who was a year older than me. My job didn't offer many opportunities to meet people, and Charles felt lucky to have connected with someone like me. We hit it off immediately and soon got engaged, with marriage on the horizon. Our romance blossomed, and we married 4 years ago. At first, our marriage was filled with love and mutual admiration. Charles often praised my work ethic and success, which outpaced his own. But over time, his attitude shifted. He became sarcastic and envious of my income. Similarly, my once supportive in-laws began to change, growing distant and colder. They had initially praised how well I got along with Charles and were excited about our future together. But familial tensions soon surfaced, especially with my in-laws, and I began to question the true intentions of the people around me. Patricia, since you earn so well, why don't you buy us things every now and then? I want a designer bag, my mother-in-law insisted, almost as if it were my obligation, despite having recently gifted her a dress for her birthday. I held firm on my stance of not lending or borrowing money, even to family, which enraged them. How dare you? My mother-in-law interrupted. We only accepted this marriage because you have a good job at the bank. Frankly, we can't stand you. You're too outspoken. My father-in-law joined in, scolding me further, while Charles simply nodded in agreement, offering no support. Meanwhile, Charles made extravagant purchases without consulting me, expensive takeout, costly furniture, always justifying it by saying, "You have a good income. This should be fine," completely disregarding the fact that his earnings were insufficient to cover these expenses, leaving me to manage the finances alone. The mistreatment from Charles and his family, combined with the lack of support, led me to consider divorce. Thankfully, we had no children, which made the decision somewhat simpler. However, when I attempted to bring up the topic of divorce, Charles would always avoid it, dismissing my concerns with "I'm too tired to talk about that today," and heading to bed. Then, I received a call from my mother that changed everything. "Listen carefully, it's about your dad," she said, her voice tense. She explained that my father had been diagnosed with cancer and needed immediate hospitalization. I rushed to prepare to leave for the hospital, but when Charles asked where I was going, I explained the situation. His indifferent response was disheartening. Once again, I was left to deal with a serious family issue alone. At the hospital, my mother and I learned the devastating news. My father's cancer was terminal, and he didn't have much time left. We debated whether or not to tell him the full truth, but we decided he deserved honesty. When I returned home, emotionally exhausted, Charles barely acknowledged my distress, asking, "Back from your dad's hospital, huh? How bad is it?" Despite my pain, I told him about my father's dire prognosis. His response was chilling and self-centered. "Oh, weren't you talking about divorce? If you want to stress your already sick father with our problems, I'm ready whenever you are," he said coldly, completely insensitive to the gravity of the situation. But that wasn't the worst of it. His next words left me speechless. "So, what about your dad's inheritance? How much are we talking about? I'm his son-in-law, so I should get a share, right?" The audacity to bring up something so distasteful while my father was still fighting for his life was appalling. "That's ridiculous. My dad is still alive. How can you even think about that?" I protested, but Charles didn't even flinch. He continued speculating about the inheritance, his greed making my stomach turn. I could no longer tolerate the situation at home. I chose to stay at my parents' house. It was closer to the hospital, and I needed to be there for my father. I informed my mother of my decision, explaining that I would be staying with them for the foreseeable future to be near him. After some time, my father passed away peacefully, as though slipping into a gentle sleep. His departure left a profound emptiness, and in those quiet moments with my mother, I began to realize the depth of the challenges ahead. The grief felt unbearable, as though we had already exhausted all our tears. Yet amidst this sorrow, there were still funeral arrangements to manage. Amid the heaviness of it all, I contacted Charles to inform him of my father's passing and the upcoming funeral. Despite the strain in our relationship and my desire for a divorce, I felt it was necessary to inform him since we were still legally married. His response, however, was as callous as I expected. "So, your dad finally passed away, huh? Sorry for your loss, but I don't feel like attending the funeral. It's too much of a hassle," he said nonchalantly. His lack of empathy solidified my worst suspicions about him. Though I had secretly hoped he would show some respect by attending, his indifference extinguished any remaining affection I might have had for him, leaving only contempt. Surprised by the frostiness in my tone, I replied sharply, "Do whatever you want. Why are you so upset? Oh, and I'm curious about the inheritance." His words were laced with mockery. Unable to stomach his cruelty any longer, I ended the call abruptly. Charles didn't attend the funeral, and while some labeled him heartless, I found it better he stayed away. His absence spared us the pain of his presence during such a solemn occasion, allowing us to honor my father's memory in peace. After the funeral, my family, my mother and I, gathered to discuss my father's estate. Fortunately, my father had made clear decisions about his assets ahead of time, so we were able to settle everything with relative ease, finding some semblance of closure. When I returned home, however, Charles blindsided me with an audacious plan. "Hey, it's been a while," he said casually. "I've decided to use the $6 million you inherited to renovate the family house." I was stunned. I had no idea how he knew about the money or why he assumed he had the right to use it for renovations. "What do you mean? I have no idea about any large sum of money," I asked, my confusion evident. With a smug chuckle, Charles revealed, "I had a chat with your mom. I might nudge her a bit, hinting that if she didn't spill the beans about the inheritance, I might consider a divorce. She quickly told me everything." The realization that he had coerced my mother into revealing details about the inheritance left me seething. "You're despicable," I shouted, threatening my mother just to find out. "That's a low blow." "I don't care," he replied dismissively. "The renovations are already underway with that $6 million. "You're unbelievable," I muttered under my breath, shocked by the audacity of his actions. "Yep, lucky me for snagging that cash. Good thing we're still hitched," Charles said smugly. While I was consumed with funeral arrangements, he had already initiated the renovations using the inheritance money. Betrayed and speechless, I had no choice but to face the harsh reality of Charles's manipulative and self-serving nature. The tension in our crumbling marriage had reached its breaking point. Charles' smirk was utterly repulsive as he presented me with an ultimatum, his voice dripping with false generosity. "You have two choices," he said, his tone condescending. "Move in with my parents or file for divorce." I took a deep breath, holding his gaze with calm resolve. "I choose divorce, and I won't regret it," I replied, my voice steady. Charles laughed dismissively, clearly convinced I'd eventually regret my decision. "From now on, we'll communicate through this lawyer," he said, handing me a business card. His tone shifted slightly as he added, "And don't forget to transfer the inheritance to my account." Silently, I began packing my things, the weight of the situation settling in. As I walked out the door, Charles's voice followed me, a constant reminder of his greed. "Don't forget about the inheritance." Once I had finished explaining everything to my mother, she was stunned, not fully aware of the extent of the strain between Charles and me. She apologized for sharing details about the inheritance under his pressure. "It's all right, Mom," I reassured her. "I should have been more open, but him threatening you is unforgivable." I then asked if I could stay at our family home until I found a new place. Without hesitation, she agreed. The following day, my phone rang non-stop with calls from Charles, all of which I ignored. Eventually, he showed up at my parents' house, ringing the doorbell incessantly and causing a scene. My mother, worried about the disturbance, suggested I speak with him. "It might not resolve anything," she said, "but if he escalates, we'll call the police." Reluctantly, I agreed. With the security chain fastened, I cracked the door open just enough to speak. "This is getting out of hand." "Patricia," Charles shouted, his voice laced with frustration. "When are you transferring that $6 million? I can't finish the renovations without it." Remaining composed, I responded, "It's under consideration." Confused, he pressed, "What do you mean, under consideration?" I took a steadying breath, clarifying, What I inherited was my father's vacation house, not cash, so I can't just transfer it to you. Charles's face went pale, registering shock. Sensing an opportunity, I pushed further. And how did you manage to secure a $6 million renovation contract without any proof of funds? He hesitated before admitting, well, I have a relative who owns a construction company. I mentioned I'd be receiving the $6 million soon, so they skipped the usual checks. If that's the case, I began, leaving my words to hang in the air as I slowly closed the door. Remember, the door shut with finality, cutting off any further discussion. Inside, I felt a mix of relief and resolve. It was clear that distancing myself from Charles was the right choice. I was ready to move forward with my life free from his manipulative grip. I called out sternly just before the door clicked shut. I warned you before we even talked about divorce. I had made it clear that this could happen, but Charles's reaction was one of disbelief and frustration. You've got to be kidding me, he exclaimed, his voice thick with anger. I already paid a deposit of $5,000 for the renovations. I was planning to cover the rest in installments. Now what am I supposed to do? He continued to argue, grasping at straws. The wife's property is the husband's too, right? Even if it's not in cash, hand over that $6 million vacation home. We're still married, aren't we? I stood firm, my tone resolute. You've got it all wrong, Charles. Inherited property isn't shared. It's mine and not a cent belongs to you. And just to be clear, we're not a couple anymore. We're total strangers. His desperation quickly turned to anger. His face flushed a deep red, and he raised his voice even louder. Stop playing games. I'm calling off the divorce. Give me the inheritance right now. He tried to reach through the gap in the door, but I stood my ground. As the situation escalated, my mother, witnessing the altercation, quickly dialed the police. When Charles heard her on the phone, he withdrew his hand but then smirked, his expression sinister. I'm done with you, he sneered before fleeing the scene. After he left, the police arrived. They reviewed footage from the doorbell camera and suggested they might take action. The officers emphasized the importance of my safety, advising me to avoid engaging with Charles in the future. They told me to keep the doors locked and, if necessary, pretend I wasn't home. 5 days later, I received a call from the police about the real estate documents concerning my father's vacation home. I had placed them in my bag after moving back to my parents' house post-divorce, only to find them missing. Later, I learned the documents had been recovered, and when I arrived at the police station, I was shocked to find Charles there. It turned out he had stolen the documents. I demanded an explanation. With a sullen expression, he muttered, You thought there might be cash in your bag since you inherited $6 million, right? So when I went through your stuff, I stumbled upon some important-looking documents related to the inheritance and decided to take them. He explained that at the time, he hadn't closely examined the documents. It wasn't until I clarified that the $6 million wasn't in cash that the reality of his situation sank in. Desperation and misguided assumptions had led him to this point. When Charles realized the documents he'd taken were for a vacation house rather than cash, he attempted to convert the inheritance into money. He took the property title to a real estate agent, hoping to initiate a sale. He even brought my in-laws along. But when I arrived at the realtor's office, it was clear the sale couldn't go through. The title was still in my father's name, and I was in the process of transferring it to mine. Even though the inheritance was settled, the property was still legally mine, and Charles couldn't sell it without my consent. Frustrated, Charles and my in-laws absurdly suggested that I buy the property myself since it belonged to my father-in-law. The real estate agent, suspicious of their aggressive behavior, called the police. As I stood in shock, Charles began to desperately plead with the officer. I was just trying to sell it on her behalf. I didn't steal anything. I haven't done anything wrong. Please let me go. His earlier admission contradicted his plea, and I remained composed as I clarified to the officer, That's not true. I didn't ask him to sell anything. He stole the documents on his own, and the documents he took were copies, not originals. Even if he tried, he couldn't have sold them. Charles's anger flared. You set me up. Don't play games with me, he shouted. I responded coolly. What are you even talking about? You stole on your own initiative, and now all you do is spout nonsense. Just face the consequences of your actions. Frustrated and cornered, Charles bit his lip in anger. The evidence against him was clear, and he was arrested for theft. With news of Charles's arrest and his loss of the $55,000 deposit, my in-laws were disgraced. As the parents of a criminal, they felt compelled to leave town due to the embarrassment. They later harbored resentment toward the real estate agency that had reported Charles, resorting to making harassing calls and spreading false rumors. In response, the agency filed a lawsuit for obstructing business and attempted fraud, as they had tried to sell a property they didn't own. The aftermath was disastrous for my in-laws. They were financially drained, forced to pay a substantial amount in damages. In a desperate move, they reached out to me. "Patricia, please, we used up our savings for the deposit, and now we're in debt because of the settlement." My ex-mother-in-law's voice trembled with urgency over the phone. But I felt no sympathy. "Why are you asking me for help? I'm divorced from Charles, and as far as I'm concerned, you're strangers to me now," I replied firmly. She pleaded, "You're wealthy, aren't you? Can you spare some money? We'll pay you back, I promise." "I don't believe that for a second," I said coldly. "I'm ending this call. Don't contact me again." I hung up and blocked their numbers. I had already blocked Charles's number long ago. Concerned for our safety, especially since Charles knew where my parents lived, I decided to sell our family home. My mother and I moved to a new place, ensuring our peace of mind. As for the vacation home that had caused so much conflict, I put it back on the market. It sold quickly and without complications, allowing my mother and me to start fresh. Now, we live in a peaceful environment, free from the past turmoil, cherishing the memories of my father and enjoying our newfound tranquility.